never thought I'd be the kind of person sitting in an art studio, holding a charcoal pencil with sweaty palms, waiting for someone to walk in and pose without clothes. But there I was, 23 years old, trying to figure out how I ended up in this situation. Let me back up a bit. I grew up in a pretty traditional family, the kind where we changed the channel if something even slightly awkward came on TV. Museums? Sure, we'd visit them, but my parents would hurry past certain sections with a quick, "Let's keep moving," under their breath. I learned early on that some things were just uncomfortable. You didn't talk about them. You definitely didn't stare at them. Fast forward to my final year at art school. I was studying graphic design, which seemed safe enough. Computers, colors, logos, that sort of thing. But then I hit a wall. To graduate, I needed one more elective credit, and the only class that fit my schedule? Advanced figure drawing, the kind where real people pose as models. I tried everything to get out of it. I went to the academic advisor twice. I even considered taking an extra semester just to avoid this one class. But money was tight and my student loans were already piling up. So I gave in. I signed up, told myself it would be fine, and spent the next 2 weeks having mild panic attacks every time I thought about it. The first day arrived way too fast. I remember walking into that studio and the smell hit me first. Charcoal dust, paint thinner, and something else I couldn't quite name. Old canvas, maybe. The room was huge, with tall windows that let in this bright, almost harsh natural light. There were easels set up in a semicircle, all facing a small platform in the center. Other students were already there, chatting casually like this was the most normal thing in the world. Some were unpacking expensive-looking art supplies. Others were stretching, getting ready like this was some kind of sport. I found a spot in the corner, set up my easel, and tried to blend into the background. The professor walked in right on time. She was this small, energetic woman, probably in her 50s, with paint stains on her jeans and wild gray hair pulled into a messy bun. She clapped her hands together and smiled at all of us like we were about to start the most exciting adventure of our lives. "Welcome to figure drawing," she said, her voice carrying easily across the room. "Some of you are nervous. I can see it on your faces. That's perfectly normal. But here's what you need to understand. The human body is just another subject. Like a bowl of fruit, like a landscape, like a building. It has shapes, shadows, proportions. Your job isn't to feel anything particular about it. Your job is to see it clearly and draw what you see." Easy for her to say. My hands were already shaking and the model hadn't even arrived yet. She went on about the history of figure drawing, about how all the great masters had studied anatomy, how understanding the human form was essential to understanding art itself. I tried to focus on her words to let them calm me down, but my mind kept wandering to what was about to happen. Would I be able to do this? Would everyone notice how uncomfortable I was? What if I couldn't even look at the model? Then the door opened and the first model walked in. He was just a regular guy, maybe in his 50s, with a friendly face and a dad bod. He was wearing a bathrobe and carrying a cup of coffee. He actually waved at some of the students like he knew them. Later, I'd learned that many models worked with the same classes semester after semester. They had their favorite professors, their preferred poses, their own little routines. The professor gestured toward the platform, and the model set down his coffee, chatted with her for a moment about how his week had been, then casually removed his robe and stepped onto the platform. Just like that. Like he was taking off a jacket. I felt my face go hot. My first instinct was to look away, to suddenly become very interested in organizing my charcoal pencils. But the professor was watching the class, and I knew that looking away would only make things worse. So I forced myself to look, to actually see what was in front of me. And here's the weird thing that happened. After the first few seconds of absolute mortification, something shifted. The professor called out instructions. "We'll start with 2-minute gesture drawings. Quick sketches to capture the overall pose. Don't worry about details yet, just the basic shapes and movement." The model took his first pose. An arm raised, weight on one leg, head turned slightly. The professor set a timer and suddenly I was moving. My hand was drawing lines without really thinking about it. I was trying to capture the angle of his shoulder, the curve of his spine, the way his weight shifted. I wasn't thinking about being uncomfortable anymore. I was just working. The timer went off. The model shifted to a new pose. My hand moved again. 2 minutes. Another pose. Then another. The repetition created this strange rhythm. Draw, observe, draw, observe. My brain started to quiet down. All those years of being taught that this was something to be embarrassed about began to fade into the background. By the end of that first session, I'd filled several pages with quick sketches. Some were terrible. Some were actually not bad. But the important thing was that I'd done it. I'd survived my first figure drawing class. And weirdly, I was kind of looking forward to the next one. Over the following weeks, different models came through. An elderly woman with silver hair and graceful hands who told us stories between poses about her years as a dancer. A young athletic guy who could hold incredibly difficult positions without even trembling. A person with fascinating tattoos that told their life story across their skin. Each model brought their own energy, their own presence, and I got better. Not just at drawing, though that improved too, but at seeing. Actually seeing. The professor had been right. The human body really was just another subject. It had its own architecture, its own logic. A shoulder was just a ball joint. A torso was just a series of cylinders and curves. Once I stopped thinking of it as something taboo and started thinking of it as a puzzle to solve, everything became easier. I started coming to class early to get the best spot. I experimented with different drawing techniques. I even volunteered to help set up the studio sometimes. The nervous kid who couldn't make eye contact had been replaced by someone genuinely interested in improving their craft. But I'll be honest, there was still a part of me that felt like I was faking it. Like I'd learned to act comfortable rather than actually being comfortable. I could draw the human form now, sure. But had I really changed, or had I just gotten better at hiding my discomfort? I didn't know the answer to that question. Not yet. But I was about to find out in the most unexpected way possible. Because 3 months into the semester, on an ordinary Tuesday morning that started like any other, everything I thought I'd learned was about to be tested in a way I never could have imagined. That Tuesday would become the day I talk about whenever anyone asks me about my time in art school. The day that changed not just how I drew, but how I understood what art really meant. The day a professional model decided to teach us a lesson that had nothing to do with anatomy or technique, and everything to do with truth. That Tuesday started off completely normal. I woke up, grabbed my usual coffee from the campus cafe, and headed to the studio about 15 minutes early. By this point in the semester, I'd developed a routine. I liked getting there before everyone else. It gave me time to set up my easel just right, arrange my charcoals in the order I'd use them, and mentally prepare for the session ahead. The morning was unusually cold for October. I remember that detail clearly because the heating in the old art building never worked properly, and we could see our breath in the studio until the space warmed up from all the bodies and work. I'd worn an extra sweater that day, this thick gray thing that made me look like I'd borrowed my dad's clothes. I set up in my usual corner spot. By now I'd figured out that this particular position gave me the best angle and lighting. The morning sun came through the tall windows at just the right slant, creating these interesting shadows that made it easier to see the model's form. Little details like that mattered when you were trying to improve. Other students started filtering in. There was the usual morning chatter, someone complaining about an exam in their art history class, a couple of people discussing where to grab lunch after, 2 students in the back arguing about whether digital art was real art or not. Normal stuff. Comfortable stuff. I was testing my charcoal on some scrap paper, making sure it had the right level of softness, when the professor walked in. But she wasn't alone. There was someone with her I'd never seen before. The new model was probably in her late 20s, maybe early 30s. She had this presence about her that was different from the other models we'd worked with. Dark hair pulled back so tight it looked almost severe. But it was her eyes that really caught my attention. They were sharp, observant, like she was taking in every detail of the room and filing it away for later. The professor clapped her hands to get everyone's attention. The chatter died down. Good morning, everyone. Today we have a special guest. This is a professional model who's worked with some of the top artists and studios around the world. She specializes in challenging dynamic poses that will really test your skills. This session is going to be different from what you're used to, so I want everyone to stay focused and open-minded. Different. That word stuck in my head. What did different mean? The model didn't say anything. She just nodded at the class, her expression neutral and professional. Then she walked behind the changing screen in the corner, the same screen every model used to prepare. I turned back to my easel, did my usual pre-class ritual, adjusted my stool height, made sure my eraser was within easy reach, took a few deep breaths. Around me, everyone else was doing the same. Papers rustling, charcoal sticks being tested, the familiar sounds of a class getting ready to work. I'd done this enough times now that the nervousness was mostly gone. Sure, there was still a little flutter in my stomach at the start of each session, but nothing like those first few classes. I'd gotten comfortable with the routine, but then something happened that shattered that comfortable routine completely. The model emerged from behind the screen, and instead of walking directly to the platform like every other model had done, she started moving through the studio, just walking among us between the easels, completely bare, like she was inspecting something, or looking for something. The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pencil drop. This wasn't how things worked. Models always went straight to the platform. They took their pose, we drew. That was the protocol. That was the comfortable, predictable routine we'd all gotten used to. But she wasn't following that routine. She was walking slowly, deliberately, looking at each of us. And I don't mean just glancing around the room. I mean really looking, making eye contact, studying faces. It was intense in a way I hadn't experienced before in that studio. My heart started beating faster. I could feel that old nervousness creeping back, the kind I thought I'd moved past. What was happening? Was this part of the lesson? Some kind of test? I glanced at the professor, but she was just standing there calmly, watching like this was all perfectly normal. The model moved past the first row of easels. A couple of students shifted uncomfortably. One guy suddenly became very interested in arranging his charcoals. Another student sat perfectly still, trying not to react at all. I watched all this from my corner spot, grateful that I was tucked away out of the main path, but then she turned, and I realized with a sinking feeling in my stomach that she wasn't just wandering randomly. She was looking for someone specific. Her eyes swept across the room, pausing on different faces, moving on, searching. And then her eyes landed on me. Everything in my body told me to look away, to suddenly find something fascinating about my blank paper, to pretend I hadn't noticed. But I was frozen, completely frozen. My charcoal was in my hand, hovering uselessly above the paper. My breath caught in my throat. She started walking toward my corner. Not hurrying, not slow, just steady, purposeful steps. The sound of her bare feet on the wooden floor seemed impossibly loud in the silent studio. Every step brought her closer, closer, and I couldn't move. Couldn't look away. Couldn't do anything except sit there like a deer in headlights. Time did this weird thing where it felt like it was moving both too fast and too slow at the same time. Part of my brain was screaming at me to do something, say something, react somehow. But another part was completely blank, just static and confusion. She was 3 steps away, then 2, then 1, and then she was standing right in front of my easel. Right in front of me. So close that if I'd leaned forward even slightly, I would have fallen off my stool. I could see every detail. The slight rise and fall of her breathing. A small scar on her collarbone. The way her hands trembled just slightly, which was weird because everything else about her seemed so confident and in control. My classmates were all watching now. I could feel their eyes on us, on this bizarre situation unfolding in the corner of the studio. Someone coughed. Someone else's chair creaked. But nobody said anything. Nobody moved. We were all just suspended in this strange moment, waiting to see what would happen next. And that's when she reached out her hand. Slowly, deliberately, she raised it toward my face. I should have pulled back. I should have said something. But I didn't. I just sat there, frozen, as her fingertips made contact with my cheek. Her hand was cool. That's what I remember most clearly. Cool fingertips against my burning hot face. She was touching my face, and I was sitting there letting it happen. And the entire class was watching. And I had absolutely no idea what was going on or why this was happening to me. She leaned in slightly, and I could hear her breathing. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow cutting through the silence like a knife. "Don't even breathe," she said. And I didn't. I literally held my breath. My lungs were burning, my heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone must be able to hear it, but I didn't breathe. I just sat there, her hand on my face, her eyes locked on mine. The world reduced to this one impossible moment that seemed like it would never end. I don't know how long she stood there with her hand on my face. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 30 seconds, maybe 45. Time had completely lost all meaning. All I knew was that my lungs were screaming for air, my face was burning hot, and I couldn't look away from her eyes even if I'd wanted to. There was something in her expression that I couldn't quite read. It wasn't mockery. It wasn't cruelty. It was more like concentration, like she was studying me, reading something in my face that I didn't even know was there. And the weird thing was, despite how absolutely mortified I felt, despite the fact that my entire class was watching this bizarre scene unfold, I also felt something else, something I didn't expect. I felt seen, really seen, not just looked at, but actually seen. Her hand was still pressed gently against my cheek. I could feel the slight tremor in her fingers, which told me something important. She was nervous too. This confident professional model who'd worked with famous artists all over the world was standing here, hand shaking slightly, doing something that clearly wasn't easy for her either. That realization changed something. Suddenly, this wasn't just something being done to me. This was something we were both experiencing, both being vulnerable in. The power dynamic I'd assumed existed just evaporated. We were both just people, standing in this uncomfortable, intense moment together. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it ended. She stepped back. Her hand left my face and I could finally breathe again. I gasped in air like I'd been underwater. My entire body was shaking. I gripped the edge of my easel just to have something solid to hold on to. She looked at me for one more second and then she smiled. Not a big smile, just a small one. Almost sad in a way. Then she turned to face the rest of the class and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Thank you," she said simply. "That's exactly what I needed." What? What did she need? What had just happened? I sat there completely confused, my mind racing to understand. Around me, I could hear other students shifting in their seats, whispering to each other. Everyone was just as confused as I was. But the model didn't explain. She just walked to the platform in the center of the room, stepped up onto it, and took her first pose. And it wasn't a simple, straightforward pose like we were used to. She twisted her body in this complex way, one arm reaching back, her head turned at an angle, her weight balanced on one leg. It looked uncomfortable. It looked difficult to hold. But more than that, it looked vulnerable, exposed. Like she was showing us something raw and real. Not just a body to be drawn, but a person being honest about something difficult. The pose captured the exact feeling of what had just happened between us. That strange mix of vulnerability and strength, discomfort and courage. The professor's voice cut through the confused silence. "This class is what we call breaking the fourth wall." She walked to the front of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression serious but excited. "For months you've been learning to draw the human form. You've gotten comfortable with it. You've learned the techniques, the proportions, the shadows, but you've been drawing from a distance. There's been a wall between you and your subject, a comfortable professional wall that says I am the artist, you are the model, and we each have our separate roles." She gestured toward the model, still holding that difficult pose. What you just witnessed was that wall coming down. Art isn't about distance. It's not about staying comfortable and safe. It's about connection. It's about honesty. It's about being willing to really see another person and let yourself be seen in return. The professor looked directly at me. "She chose you because you needed this lesson most. And I think you all know why." My face went hot again. Of course they knew why. I was the one who'd shown up to class 3 months ago, barely able to look at the first model. I was the one who'd been fighting my discomfort the whole time, trying to act like I was fine when really I was just getting better at hiding my awkwardness. "The human body isn't just a collection of shapes and shadows," the professor continued. "It's a person. A real person with thoughts and feelings and vulnerabilities. When we forget that, when we treat our subjects like objects, we lose something essential. We lose the truth of what we're drawing." She clapped her hands together. "Now, stop thinking and start drawing. You have a pose in front of you that captures something real. Don't draw what you think you should see. Draw what you actually feel." For a moment, nobody moved. We were all still processing what had happened. But then slowly, hands started moving. Charcoal started scratching across paper. The familiar sounds of work began to fill the studio again. I looked down at my blank page. My hand was still shaking. I picked up my charcoal and almost dropped it. "Come on," I told myself. "Focus, draw. That's why you're here." But something was different. When I looked at the model now, I didn't see her the way I'd seen the other models. I didn't see a subject, a collection of shapes to be studied and reproduced. I saw a person who'd just done something incredibly brave. who'd made herself vulnerable in front of a room full of strangers to teach us something important. And I saw myself differently too. I saw all the walls I'd built up, all the ways I'd been hiding behind technique and practice and getting better. I'd thought I was learning to be comfortable with figure drawing, but really I'd just been learning to be numb to it, to not feel anything at all, but feeling nothing wasn't the answer. The discomfort wasn't something to overcome or hide from. It was information. It was honest. And art, real art, required that kind of honesty. My hand started moving across the paper. The lines were different this time, bolder, less careful. I wasn't trying to get it perfect. I was trying to capture what I was actually experiencing. The strength in her pose, the difficulty of holding it, the courage it took to stand there after what she'd just done. The charcoal moved faster. I filled page after page with quick studies, each one trying to capture something different. The tension in her muscles, the angle of her head, the way her fingers curved. I wasn't thinking about technique anymore. I wasn't worried about whether my proportions were right or if I was using the correct shading method. I was just drawing what I saw, what I felt, and it was the most honest work I'd ever done. After about 20 minutes, the model shifted to a new pose, then another. The session continued like normal, but nothing felt normal. Everything felt heightened, more real. I could hear every sound in the studio. The scratch of charcoal on paper, someone's chair creaking, the wind outside rattling the old windows. When the class finally ended 2 hours later, I had more drawings than I'd ever produced in a single session. And they were different. I could see it immediately. They had weight to them, presence. They weren't just technically correct drawings of a human form. They were drawings that captured something true. As I packed up my supplies, my hands finally steady again, I kept glancing at the model. She was behind the changing screen now, getting dressed. Part of me wanted to go talk to her, to understand better what had happened and why. But another part of me was afraid that talking about it would somehow break the spell, would make me analyze it too much and lose whatever I'd just learned. The other students were leaving, talking excitedly about the session. I heard fragments of their conversations. That was intense. I've never experienced anything like that. Did you see his face? They were talking about me, obviously. But I didn't care. Let them talk. I was still standing there staring at my drawings when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw the model, now dressed in regular clothes. Jeans and a big sweater. She looked so different now, so normal, almost like a completely different person from the one who'd walked up to me and touched my face. "Hey," she said quietly, "can we talk for a minute?" My first instinct was to say no, to pack up my stuff quickly and get out of there before things got even more awkward. But something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that I desperately needed to understand what had just happened. Or maybe it was because, despite everything, I felt like I owed her the courtesy of listening. "Yeah," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I expected. "Sure." Most of the other students had already left. The few who remained were packing up their things, throwing curious glances our way, but trying not to be obvious about it. The professor had stepped out, probably to give us some privacy. The studio felt different now, quieter, with just the two of us and the late morning light streaming through those tall windows. She pulled up a stool and sat down across from me. Up close in regular clothes, she looked younger than I'd thought. There were dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't been sleeping well. Her hands fidgeted with the strap of her bag. All that confidence and intensity from earlier seemed to have drained away, leaving behind just a tired person who'd done something difficult. "I owe you an explanation," she started, her voice quiet. "What I did? That's not standard. That's not how these sessions usually go. And I need you to know that I wasn't trying to embarrass you or make you uncomfortable for no reason." I nodded, not sure what to say. Part of me wanted to tell her it was fine, that I understood, but the truth was I didn't understand. "Not really," she took a deep breath. "Can I ask you something first? Why were you so uncomfortable? When I walked in, I could see it immediately. The way you held your shoulders. The death grip on your charcoal. The way you kept looking at your paper instead of around the room. You were the most tense person here." I felt my face heating up again. "Is it that obvious?" "To someone who's looking for it, yes," she said, and there was no judgment in her voice. Just honesty. "I've been doing this work for 7 years now. Modeling for art classes, for private artists, for photography studios, and I've gotten pretty good at reading people, at seeing who's genuinely comfortable and who's just pretending to be. I sat back on my stool thinking about how to answer. I grew up in a pretty conservative home, I finally said. We didn't talk about, bodies and stuff. It was always something to be covered up, something private. When I signed up for this class, I spent weeks dreading it. And even though I've gotten better over the semester, even though I can draw now without my hands shaking, there's still this voice in the back of my head telling me that what I'm doing is somehow wrong. She nodded like she understood completely. That's exactly what I thought. And that's why I chose you. But why? I asked, and I couldn't keep the frustration out of my voice. Why single me out like that? Why make it even more uncomfortable? Because comfortable wasn't helping you, she said simply. You were learning to function despite your discomfort. You were learning to draw around it, to work through it. But you weren't actually dealing with it. You were just building better walls, I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. Because she was right. I'd been so proud of myself for getting better at figure drawing, but really, I'd just gotten better at pretending. At going through the motions without actually feeling anything. I've modeled for hundreds of students, she continued, and I've watched so many of them go through what you're going through. They learn the technical skills. They learn to draw the human form accurately, but they never really see it. They never let themselves be vulnerable enough to actually connect with what they're drawing. And you know what? Their art shows it. The drawings are technically correct, but empty. Lifeless. She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her expression intense. When I stand on that platform, I'm not just a subject. I'm a person making myself vulnerable in front of strangers. Every time I pose, I'm offering something precious, my trust, my humanity, my willingness to be seen completely. And the least an artist can do is really see me. Not just my body, but me as a person. I'd never thought about it that way. All this time, I'd been so focused on my own discomfort, my own struggle to be okay with figure drawing, that I'd never considered what it meant for the models, what they were offering us. That thing I did today, she said, walking up to you, touching your face, asking you not to breathe, that wasn't about power or control. It was about breaking down the distance between us, about forcing both of us to acknowledge each other as real people having a real moment together. It worked, I admitted. After that, when I was drawing, everything felt different, more real. That's because you stopped hiding, she said. For those 30 seconds when I had my hand on your face, you couldn't hide behind technique or distance or professional boundaries. You just had to be there, completely present, completely honest about how uncomfortable and confused you were. And that honesty, that vulnerability, that's what art needs. We sat in silence for a moment. Outside, I could hear students walking past, talking and laughing. Normal campus sounds. But inside the studio, everything felt suspended, like we existed in our own bubble outside of regular time. I'm sorry if I scared you, she said after a while. That wasn't my intention. But I'm not sorry I did it, because I think you needed it. I think you needed someone to push you past comfortable and into real. You're right, I said, and saying it out loud felt like letting go of something heavy I'd been carrying. I did need it. I just didn't know I needed it until it happened. She smiled, and it was a genuine smile this time, reaching her eyes. Can I tell you something? My hands were shaking the entire time. When I walked up to you, when I touched your face, I was terrified. Because I was making myself just as vulnerable as I was asking you to be. What I do, this whole approach to modeling, it's not easy. Every time I do it, I'm risking rejection, misunderstanding, or having someone think I'm just being weird for attention. Why do you do it then? I asked. Why put yourself through that? Because art matters, she said simply. Real art, honest art. Art that actually says something true about being human. That kind of art doesn't come from comfort and safety. It comes from being willing to be vulnerable, to take risks, to connect with other people in authentic ways. And if I can help students understand that, if I can push them to create something real instead of just something technically correct, then the discomfort is worth it. I looked down at my drawings from the session spread across my easel. She was right. They were different from anything I'd done before. They had life in them, weight, presence. They weren't just studies of human anatomy. They were drawings that captured something true about vulnerability and courage and connection. Thank you, I said, looking back up at her. I mean it. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for pushing me. Even though it was terrifying in the moment, I think I learned more in those 30 seconds than I learned in 3 months of classes. You're welcome, she said, standing up and slinging her bag over her shoulder. And hey, can I give you one more piece of advice? Sure. Don't try to get rid of your discomfort, she said. Don't treat it like something you need to overcome or fix. It's information. It's telling you something about yourself, about what you've been taught, about what you're ready to unlearn. The discomfort isn't your enemy. It's actually your greatest teacher if you're brave enough to listen to it. She headed toward the door, then paused and looked back. Keep drawing. Keep being honest. And remember that the best art comes from being willing to feel everything, even the uncomfortable stuff, especially the uncomfortable stuff. And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the studio with my drawings and my thoughts and a completely different understanding of what it meant to be an artist. In the weeks that followed, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about that Tuesday morning. The memory of Sophia's fingertips on his face, her whispered command, her unflinching presence, it had cracked something open in him that he hadn't known was sealed shut. His artwork changed. The figures he drew now had a weight to them, a presence that his earlier work had lacked. Professor Chen noticed immediately, praising the emotional honesty in his lines. His classmates asked what had shifted, but Marcus found it difficult to explain. How could he describe that a moment of profound discomfort had taught him more about art than months of comfortable practice? He started to examine the sources of his shame and awkwardness, the messages he'd internalized about bodies and propriety, the fear of being seen as improper or perverted, the walls he'd built between himself and genuine connection, not just in art, but in life. Sophia hadn't just challenged his ability to draw. She'd challenged his entire relationship with vulnerability. Marcus began to understand that art wasn't about mastering technique or overcoming discomfort. It was about being willing to stand in that discomfort, to let it inform the work, to be honest about what you saw and felt. Every model who stepped onto that platform was offering something sacred, their trust, their body, their willingness to be seen. The least he could do was see them clearly, without the filter of his own fear. By the time the semester ended, Marcus had created a portfolio he was genuinely proud of. But more importantly, he'd learned to breathe through uncertainty, to stay present in moments that challenged him, and to recognize that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the most unexpected encounters. Years later, when he'd become an established artist himself, Marcus would tell his own students about the day a woman walked straight up to him, touched his face, and whispered, "Don't even breathe." And he'd explain that in that moment of frozen time, he'd learned the most important lesson of his artistic life, that true seeing requires courage, presence, and the willingness to be changed by what you observe.